Hello, my name is Jasper Waugh, and this is my 2020 science fair, Saved by the Bell Controller, around building a new bell controller, the device that triggers the bells, for the school. But first, the problem I was trying to solve. So the problem is, the old Huanui bell controller was difficult to program, had limited functionality, and kept losing time. This frustrated both students and teachers, and at times causing mass confusion from errors resulting from the listed problems. For example, at one point, at the end of the day, the students gave up on waiting for the late bell in form class, and instead just left based off their watches. The teachers, as one would expect, attempted to stop them from leaving before the bell rang as best they could. This and the like in general just caused a lot of chaos. On the right of the screen, I've got all the options to replace the old bell controller. So we've got a selection of a differing price range. On the lowest end of the scale, on the dynamic, fully automated school bell timer, is $107, and that's the cheapest I could find. Moving up to the one that the school has was the Flash Monotron 300 CS, which is $300 to $400 to buy new, and that was programmable using 5 buttons and device else. This was hard to program. The teacher spent hours trying to program it, and on its last term of use, they managed to get it to ring on time, but it was ringing twice, and they were too afraid to reprogram it because they had to redo everything to change the bell sound. There's also a lot more options, but they aren't particularly good ones. So, onto my solution when I tried to solve this problem. The first part is the user interface. I needed to make this better than the original solution, so I made it the simplest I could by making it a Google Sheet. All you have to do, like a spreadsheet, you just have to enter in the times. And this Google Sheet has got a ton of behind-the-scenes scripts during validation and trying to mitigate the risk of malformed inputs. I also included an additional tool to produce a sequence of bell times. This made it incredibly easy to adjust the bell times for things like parent-teacher interviews or basically anything. But of course, you can't just make a bell controller from a Google Sheet. There also needs to be the hardware. I made a custom 3D printed box housing a Raspberry Pi 2, all your standard Ethernet, micro USB cable, and then Raspberry Pi was connected to a relay which just interfaced where the old bell controller interface. I also included some status monitoring, like an LED power and internet indicators. And I also took this opportunity to make another improvement of the old bell controller, physical controls. So you can easily mute the bell and ring it now without having to use the old handbell when trying to bring in students early or late. You can see the final design on the left. This is after 2 iterations. So we also need to have software on that hardware, which is coming into what's running on the Raspberry Pi. So it's just running Raspberry with a couple Python scripts that, for the main driver codes, continuously checks the current time against the list of bell times. As soon as there is a match, the bell is rung, and then it waits a minute before starting to check again. Every 15 minutes, it reaches out to a Google Sheet API and checks a hash of the bell times. If the hash is different from the last hash, it pulls all the new bell times down to the Raspberry Pi's SD cards. On the right, you can see the cleanish code with the main driver codes with all the utilities extracted away into helper functions. You can see on line 216 the main loop, which just waits until a new minute, and then it checks the bell and decides when to contact the Google Sheet API. On the top of the screen, you can see a simple diagram of how the bell works. So the Raspberry Pi is on the middle right, which does a two-way communication, reaches out to the Google Sheets, and communicates with the bell. So, onto the conclusion. Since version 1 and version 2 prototypes were installed with the old bell controller on hand, but the version 3 prototype has now fully replaced the old bell controller. It has been running the school bells for almost a term now, and has been almost completely successful. A recent feature request for the dedicated method of inserting repeated bell rings, such as those used in parent-teacher interviews, is complete. The primary changes noticed by the students is that they can finally count down to the bell ring, and the noticeable uptake in bell scheduling changes, as the staff are no longer afraid of changing the bell. Over time, feature requests become more trivial as time passes, as now practically completely dried up. the case is sold and can potentially stay as an exemplar for the much underused 3D printer. For now, time is the ultimate test, as something is bound to fail eventually, but with the current design, it should be trivial to repair and upgrade. In terms of future upgrades, the bell length and sound is currently not configurable. Clearly, further research is needed. In summary, the prototypes were successful, while leaving a few pathways for future developments. You can also see on the right a quote from the teacher that originally proposed the problem to me. If you have a read, you'll find that he is very happy about the new system. Moving through these quicker now, the larger issue is that the number of sales of school bell systems and the like are very low, meaning that companies have little reason to innovate and make more consumer-friendly products. Considering the R&D costs, it's logical that they'll either keep their 30-year-old design or charge lofty prices as they're doing. Moving on to the fact that open source is the perfect space to fill this, as the entirety of my project code is fully open source for anybody to view and use, including all the spelling mistakes in my variable names. The GitHub repository is under the MIT license. You can find the GitHub repository with all the codes at the link on the bottom right. This means that others can view, update, and improve the code. Moving on to the tutorial, I have made a tutorial for students in other schools to create their own modern bell system for about $50 in new parts. You can find it at the link on the left. You can also see some pictures of how it's laid out. If you want to go further, as I've only done an incredibly light overview on this presentation, you can find a directory of information used for my school science fair, and you can see my log. You can also see the direct links into the GitHub repository and tutorial. There's also the time-lapse of me adding a power LED, and an unedited plan when I first started back in July of 2019. This also includes information about prototype V1, V2, and the proof of concept. Thank you for listening to my presentation.